It has now been over 2 years since Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine. In the big perspective, I think we can say that Ukraine came best out of the first year. They resisted the initial invasion and they managed to liberate big parts of the territory that Russia had occupied. I think we can also say that Russia probably had more success in the second year. They managed to withstand the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They took back the initiative, and they're right now putting the Ukrainians under pressure in a winter offensive. So what's going to happen in the third year? I was recently asked by a journalist to give an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario for where things would be in a year. And I think that's actually a clever way to frame it. So I thought I'd do the same thing here and use the same question in a video. So let's talk about it. There are a couple of reasons why I think it's a good way to frame it, to ask for an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario for the next year. The first one is that we're now at a point in a war where a year is a useful period to talk about. Earlier in the war, things were happening more quickly. There was a higher tempo. It was more a matter of weeks or months. But now both sides have accepted that this is a long war and it will probably last several years more. The second reason why I think it's a good question is that there is a very wide spectrum of possible outcomes when we look at what might happen over the coming year. The war is far from decided, and in many ways it really could go either way. So painting these two extremes is a good way to illustrate that spectrum of possibilities. So let me start with the optimistic scenario. And by optimistic, I of course mean optimistic for Ukraine. It is quite clear when we look at the battlefield right now, then Russia has an advantage when it comes to weapons and ammunition. And there are several reasons for this, but the most important reason is that Russia pretty early in the war realized that this is going to be a long war. So they started the transition to a wartime economy already sometime in the fall of 2022. And they started to make some of those tough decisions about investments in military production that are only now happening in the West. And that means that, in round numbers, Russia has about a year and a half of head start in the preparations for a long war. But I think we're also seeing right now Russia at about maximum capacity. Their production is already ramped up. Their factories are running 24/7. They have no unemployment. So it will be difficult for them to increase production more. And a lot of the equipment that they're producing is not actually new. They are benefiting from having inherited very large stockpiles of old Soviet equipment, and they're now refurbishing that and sending it to Ukraine to replace the losses. And this will be fine for a couple of years maybe, but eventually there won't be any old equipment left. And then they will have to start producing actually new equipment. So that will slow down their production. And at the same time, Russia is to a large extent also financing the war by using their savings. So they are pumping money into the state budget, and this is not going to be sustainable in the long run. There is also a significant possibility that the Russian economy is going to overheat. When there is a very low level of unemployment and at the same time money is being pumped into society, then that creates a pressure to increase the wages. And this is made worse by the way that they're recruiting soldiers for the war, because Russia is using high wages and promises of bonuses, those sorts of things, as a way to get people to sign contracts with the military. So that means that employers in other sectors have to increase the wages as well to compete with the military. And all this is something that creates inflation. So what I'm saying with all this is that there is a big possibility that the Russian economy is going to get worse, and that their military production capacity is probably at a peak right now, and that it's going to decline over the coming years. But in addition to this, Russia is also going to be politically more unstable in the coming year. I think the Putin regime is much more unstable than many people think. It hasn't even been a year since there was a military mutiny, and it can happen again. And I think it's pretty clear that the Russian government is also concerned about the stability, and that's why we see the movement toward more and more repression because they feel insecure. But despite that repression, the protest potential is going to grow. And one of the reasons is the casualty numbers. It just takes some time for casualty numbers to transform into protests. So there will be some delay there, but it will happen because there are so many casualties in this war that it can't go on for year after year without eventually leading to some kind of dissatisfaction in the Russian society. And just as importantly, there are going to be more protests about all kinds of other things that don't really have anything to do with the war because life is getting harder and prices are increasing, things don't work anymore, all kinds of things, right? So these are things that can lead to what Mark Galeotti likes to call the coalition of the fed up. So what I'm saying with all this is that Russia right now has an advantage over Ukraine when it comes to military production, but that this advantage is temporary. Russia is at the peak of its capability, but Ukraine's capability is still increasing, both because Ukraine's own production is growing, but also because the defense production is growing in the Western countries that support Ukraine. So the gap will be narrowing, and eventually Russia's own production will begin to decline, and Ukraine's capability may even begin to surpass Russia's, right? So time is not on Russia's side. Many people think it is, but it isn't. And the Ukrainians understand this. That's why the Ukrainian strategy right now is what they call an active defense. And what they mean by that is really that they will be fighting a mostly defensive fight for the time being with the goal of winning time until the defense production will grow and they can stabilize the supply chains. And then while they do that, they will focus on maximizing the Russian losses. So that's what they mean by an active defense, that it's a defense where they're trying to maximize the attrition on the Russians. So in the optimistic scenario, this is what happens. This process is fast, and 2024 will be a kind of transitional year where Ukraine will manage to fight a good defensive fight, and they will inflict a lot of casualties on Russia, and at the same time, their own defense production grows, and they stabilize the flow of support that is coming from the Western countries. And all this will mean that a year from now, Ukraine will then be in a much better position, relatively speaking. So they will have the advantages on the battlefield, and they will have the possibility of going on the offensive again. The pessimistic scenario is just about the opposite. All the things I said before about how Russia is at a peak right now and how their production is likely to fall over time and that there will be a bigger likelihood of protests as time passes, all that is still true, but it doesn't have to be decisive. Because if Russia can get quick results and they can prevent the Ukrainian capacity from growing, then it's not necessarily a problem for them that their own production has peaked and is going to decline a bit. So in the pessimistic scenario for the coming year, Russia will manage to capitalize on the current advantages that they have in the availability of weapons and ammunition, so that they will be making progress on the battlefield, and at the same time they will manage to prevent the Ukrainians from getting access to more weapons and from stabilizing the supplies. So the Russians will, in this scenario, have success with the long-range strike campaign, for example, against the Ukrainian defense industry, because the Ukrainians won't have enough air defenses to protect their factories. And in Europe, the attempts at increasing defense production will turn out to be disappointing because the necessary political decisions are not being made in time and not enough money is allocated. And in America, the political system will continue to be broken. The military support for Ukraine from the United States does not get back on track. And after the election in November, the result will be that it's obvious that it's never going to happen again. And maybe we will even get into that scenario that I talked about in a previous video, where Russia can use some kind of military aggression against NATO as a tool to sort of force the European countries to stop supporting Ukraine because they will need all the defense production for themselves. So this is the pessimistic scenario. And I think both of these scenarios are possible. And of course, they're hugely different. In the optimistic scenario, Ukraine is on the path to victory. And in the pessimistic scenario, things are looking really bleak. So I think these are the two extremes on the spectrum. And then we can imagine all kinds of scenarios in between. But what I think is interesting is that the variable between these two scenarios really is the extent to which the supply chains to Ukraine can be stabilized. In the optimistic scenario, they are stabilized a lot, and in the pessimistic scenario, they're not stabilized at all. So I really think this is where we are in the war, that the Western countries are still caught in a kind of strategic vacuum after the Ukrainian summer offensive, because it didn't produce the expected results. And the Western countries, turned out, didn't have a plan B, so it's been a really chaotic process to see how they have been discussing what to do. So we see some countries right now are making the connection that this is going to be a long war and we need to start massive defense production so Ukraine will be able to prevail. But we see other countries where there is still a discussion about how to deal with this situation and where the politicians are really struggling to make a workable strategy. And most prominently, I'm of course talking about the United States here. So I think in the end, the most interesting thing to follow in 2024 will be to see if Ukraine's Western partners will manage to find common ground and get behind a sustainable long-term strategy to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need. And if they do that, then we are on the path toward the optimistic scenario. And if they don't, then we might end up closer to the pessimistic scenario or somewhere in between. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful or informative, then please give it a like. And also remember, you can subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.